Welcome to Pragim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 62 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll discuss about ASP.NET Session State. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 59, 60, and 61 of this video series. In ASP.NET, there are different techniques to send data from one web form to another. In the previous sessions of this video series, we have discussed about cross-page postback, context.handler object, query strings, and cookies. In this session, we'll discuss about session state variables. Just like query strings, session state variables can also be used to send data from one web form to another. Let's look at an example. Let's flip to Visual Studio. I have an ASP.NET web application project here with two web forms. On web form 1, I have two text box controls where the user can enter their name and email. And once they click on this button, go to web form 2, user will be navigated to web form 2.aspx. And on this web form, we have two label controls. And these label controls will display the name and email that we have entered on this web form 1. Let's see how to do that using session state variables. I double click this button control to generate the event handler and retrieve the name from the text box txt name, and then I want to store this within a session variable. So to create a session variable, I use the session object and then use a key. I'm going to use a key called name to store the name into a session. Okay, along the same lines, to store the email, I'm going to use a key as email, and email is present in a text box called txt email. Okay, so we have stored the name and email in session variables. Now we want to redirect the user to webform2.aspx. So response.redirect, let's send the user to, within the root directory of the application, I have a web form called webform2.aspx. So let's navigate the user to that web form. Alright, so once the user lands on webform2.aspx, the page load event gets executed. On the page load event, we want to retrieve the name and email from the session and display them in the label controls. To display the name, I have a label called LBL name. So the text of this label control is equal to, I need to retrieve the name from the session variable. To retrieve the value, I again use the same key. And look at this, the key name, if you remember, it's name. And the important thing to note here is that, a session variable can be used to store any type of object. It can be integer, it can be string, it can be anything. It can even be a complex object like customer, employee, etc. Okay, that's why its return type is an object. But we know name is a string, so it's safe to convert that to string. And to do that, I'm using the toString method. Along the same lines, retrieve the email. The key for the email is email, and I want to display that in a label called LBL email. That's all. We are done. Okay, so now let's see. Let me run this. So on web form 1, we are storing name and email into the session variables, and on web form 2, we are retrieving that name and email from the session and displaying them. Let me enter the name as test and email as email test. Click on go to web form 2. On web form 2, we are displaying them. Okay, so we have just seen how to use session state variables to send data from one web form to another. But whenever we use session state variables, there are some important points to keep in mind. Session state variables are stored on the web server by default and are kept for the lifetime of the session. So where are these session state variables stored? They are stored on the web server memory. And how long are they stored on the web server memory? They are kept for the lifetime of a session. So how do we control the lifetime of a session? The lifetime of a session is controlled by an attribute called timeout that we set in the session state element. Let's see how to do that. So every web application project has got a configuration file called web.config file. Within web.config, under configuration, under system.web element, we can have a session state element. And then session state has got a mode attribute, which is very important, and in fact this is one of the very common interview question as well. We'll talk about the different session state modes in a later video session, but for now understand, I'm going to use the mode as nproc. And if we don't specify the session state mode, the default is nproc, meaning the session state variables will be stored on the web server memory. Okay, and then so how long will these session state variables be stored on the web server memory? At some point they have to be destroyed. Otherwise, at some point of time, the web server will run out of memory. So what is the time limit when these session variables will be destroyed? That is dependent on this attribute called timeout. Again, if I don't specify this timeout attribute, the default is 20 minutes. But depending on our application requirement, we can configure that. So I'm going to set this to the default value, which is 20 minutes. So this is configurable here within our web.config file. Okay. The default session mode is in proc. We have just seen that, and we'll discuss about the different session state modes in a later video session. The lifetime of a session is determined by the timeout value in web.config file. The default is 20 minutes. The timeout value can be adjusted according to your application requirements. Session state variables are available across all pages, but only for a given single session. Let's understand this point first. Session state variables are available across all pages. So what do we mean by that? If you remember, on webform1.aspx, we are storing the name and email in these session state variables. Now, and we are retrieving the values on webform2.aspx. Now let's say if I have webform 3, webform 4, webform 5, or webform 500.aspx, on all these web forms, these session state variables are accessible. You can access them and display them. Okay, but then they are available only for a given single session, which means session variables are like single user global data. Now if this point is a little confusing, what we mean by a given single session or session variables are like single user global data, don't worry, we are going to talk about those points in detail in the next session when we talk about cookieless sessions. Okay, so let's go to the next point now. It's always a good practice to check if a session state variable is null before calling any of its methods such as toString. Otherwise, we may run into runtime null reference exceptions. Let's understand what we mean by this. If you look at this application as how it stands now on webform2.aspx, where we are reading the session variable, we are directly reading it from the session. Now we know that this session state elements has got a time limit on them, 20 minutes, okay, by default. Now let's say if the 20 minutes has passed and I'm trying to access this webform.aspx, or I haven't come to webform1.aspx, I'm going directly to webform2.aspx, in which case the session variable will be null, and on null object you're calling a toString method. So what's the result? You get a null reference exception. So let me run this directly and see what's going to happen. Now look at that, object reference not set to an instance of an object, system.null reference exception, and that makes sense because there's nothing in that session variable. You're calling the toString method, so toString on a null object will cause null reference exception. So let's see how to get rid of this. That's why whenever you're trying to retrieve something out of the session, it is always good to check if that session variable is not null before kind of doing any conversion. So if session of name is not equal to null, only then try to retrieve this. And along the same lines, if session of email is not equal to null, only then try to retrieve email out of the session, convert that to string, and assign that to label. So now if I go to this web form directly, I wouldn't get any runtime exception, and that's because we're actually checking if it's not null, only then try to execute this. Otherwise this code will not be executed. The labels will be displayed empty. Alright. Application performance can be improved by disabling session state, obviously, because these session state variables are going to consume the web server memory. So obviously disabling session state can improve the performance of your application. So if your application doesn't require session state, then disable it. Disabling session state can be done at two levels. We can disable that at a web form level, or if you want to disable it for the entire application, we can do that at the application level in web.config file. So if I want to disable it at the web form level, in the page directive of the web form, in the HTML source, in the page directive, I can set enable session state is equal to false. So what does that mean? We are disabling the session state for this web form. Maybe for the other web forms, use the session state. Okay, and if I want to disable that at the application level, look at this. At the moment I have disabled session state at the web form level. So if we run this now, and if you remember, this web form is actually using session state. It's using the session variables to store data into that. Okay, so obviously now if I try to enter something into this and then click go to web form 2, as you might expect, we get an error because you have disabled session state and you're trying to use the session variable. And what does it say? Session state can only be used when enable session state is set to true. Okay, so since we disable the session state, we get that error. So let's set that back to true. And then on web form 2, similarly, if you want to disable it for web form 2, you can do that as well. But then remember, this enable session state has also got, whether you want to enable it true, otherwise false, otherwise you can set it to read only. If you look at web form 2.aspx, we are only reading the session state variables. So it's okay to set it as read only because we are not modifying the value. Okay, and if I want to disable it at the application level, I can set the session state mode to off, which means at the entire application level we are disabling session state. Okay, but if your application requires session state to be used, then go ahead and use it. But if it's not using if your application is not making use of session state, then there's no point in having it enable. Just to improve the performance of the application, disable session state. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.